Good afternoon. So as said, today I would love to talk to you about the shift I've been on from solving problems to shaping systems. And I'd like to start today with a story. This is the story of why I'm even giving the presentation today in the first place. And it starts about 6 months into being at Monzo. I gave a technical presentation. It was on how you optimize queries for BigQuery. Think making them more efficient, making them cost less money. And after this presentation, I was at the pub, because most team days seem to end up in the pub. And at the pub, one of the directors asked me, how did I think this presentation went? And we got talking. They asked me about my background. They asked me how I'd ended up giving this presentation at this team day. And what became really clear is that none of that, none of my journey, none of how I thought about the work had come through. You see, because before tech, I was a musician. I'm a classically trained singer and pianist, and I went off to university to study how to do that. How could I perform on stage? But on stage, learning in my classrooms, I actually learned I had a love for music theory. I loved structure, pattern identification. I loved finding themes, how things fitted together and evolved over time. And a slight strange journey, I was made to take a module outside of my discipline. So my university had this thing where you could partner and you could work across the university and do something different. I didn't get a lot of choice, and I ended up on a computer science program. So, yep, I was the musician in the room. I'd never studied coding. I didn't know what I was doing. Very quickly, I fell in love with it. I noticed the similarities. You're finding patterns. You're looking at systems, seeing how they evolve over time. I could see how I could apply creative thinking here and how I could look at that bigger picture and ideal solution. So this culminated in me doing a PhD. I brought the two worlds together. I decided, how can I bring computer science and music theory? And I did some crazy stuff. Anyway, I went through my PhD. I defined problems, I formed hypotheses, and I tested them. I was pushing at the edges of what we understand. And all of that meant I identified myself that way. I identified as a creative thinker. But after my PhD, I decided to go into tech. And on that journey, somewhere along the way, I stopped being creative. And I stopped using this thinking that I had learned. You see, early on in my career in tech, I felt like a huge imposter. I was a musician, sat in a room full of engineers. And I was getting advice. Be more technical, be more precise, be correct. Make sure everything you deliver has 0 errors in it. Now, some of this advice was right. You do need to be really technically strong to be a great senior engineer. But you see, somewhere along the journey, this advice becomes incomplete because you need to move into understanding which problems matter. You need to identify what's actually true. You have to make trade-offs for the organization, help them decide what they should and shouldn't be doing. And you have to start taking on problems where the answer isn't clear yet, like a PhD. So this conversation in the pub, let's go back to it for a second, because there was one question that they asked me that was the catalyst to the playbook I formed with a lot of help. And that was, what could your background do for Monzo and do for yourself? What could your background and identity as a creative thinker do to aid you in your next stage of your career? And that made me realize that before, I'd thought being really good and getting to these more senior levels in engineering was about solving more and more technical problems that were even harder, even more complex. But actually, something I could do differently and something that was really important was, how am I going to think about them? So I took a shift in thinking, starting with what's in front of you, stepping back to understand the system, and deciding what actually matters. A movement from reacting to deciding. Great engineers don't just react to what's in front of them. They notice patterns, contradictions, where effort and outcome don't match. And they step back, understand the system, they form hypotheses, and they test them. Like a PhD, like a researcher. So I realized that all this thinking I'd done in my career before tech was thinking I should be applying at work. It's thinking I should be doing at Monzo. But I had no idea on how I would start doing this or how I would turn it into impact. So I treated it like a research problem. And I developed this playbook. Now, this isn't a checklist, it's a way of working. And it came from me spending a lot of time researching. I spoke to leaders across the IC path, the manager path, your principals, your directors, your VPs, you name it, I probably spoke to them. My calendar was a mess. But I learned a lot because I asked everyone how they think. And then, what do they do about how they think? And the same pattern kept emerging. Engineers that I respected most did 4 things really well. They identified the real problem, they developed conviction about the right solution, they got people to move with them, and they made the thinking scale beyond themselves. Now, like anything, this isn't linear. You go back, you refine, you replay phases. But for the rest of the presentation today, I'd love to walk you through it, and I'm going to use an example for a project we've recently done at Monzo to step you through how we did this. The research gap. So, when I started at Monzo, you're going to get used to my story slides. Yes, they're AI generated. I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people. And I would ask them, I asked people in the operation, I asked people in engineering, data, product, what are your pain points? What are you struggling with? What are the team not giving you that you need right now? And one thing kept coming up. We couldn't clearly define how much time we spent resolving a customer problem. There were different definitions across the business. There were investigations left, right, and center. Numbers didn't add up. We would put one number into forecasting, and a different one would show up on someone else's dashboard. And that was a signal to me, because this metric was operationally important, and people were optimizing around it. And this meant when the metric was wrong, the system started teaching people the wrong behaviors. For example, people were assigning work to someone else so that it would change the metric assigned to them, and they would show as lower value in the system. And this was the signal. Something was off here. You see, everyone thought that their definition measured actual work, that it was effort to resolve a problem. But in reality, all the metrics were measured via proxies. They were signals around the signal. But what we needed to was just measure the work. All of them looked precise, but they were fragile. And that fragility broke trust because we weren't measuring what we thought we were. So that's the research gap. You're looking for things that don't quite make sense, where effort and outcome don't match, and where the system isn't behaving the way you expect. Your mindset here is exploration. You're not trying to solve it, you're just trying to understand it. You want varying opinions, you're triangulating across the business, and also across the different directions you could take. Often, the questions you're asking here are deceptively simple. Things like, why does this matter? Why do we do it this way? What are we really measuring? And I think simple questions can feel really naive. I love the example Scott Hanselman has given previously in presentations where he says he'll ask what acronyms mean in meetings. And that's not because he doesn't know what they mean, because he does. It's because he wants to create that psychological safety for others to be able to ask those simple questions too. You see, organizations often stop questioning inherited systems. And usually visible problems aren't the real problem. For example, a performance issue might be a measurement problem. A bad operational behavior might be a broken system design. You need to find the problem beneath the problem, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because then you'll be asked a much harder question. What would the right version of this look like? Conviction. So what should the system look like? In our case, with our metric, we had lots of ways we could have solved the problem. We could have focused on a data solution. We could have just gone to 1 out of the 8 definitions we had historically, aligned the business on that one single definition. We could have made the proxies and heuristics we were using to build it out a bit more accurate. But all of that still would have inferred the truth. So the principal question became, why wouldn't we make this part of the system itself? Why wouldn't we have the system tell us? So we moved it to the back end. But moving it to the back end and building its own service, that's a lot harder. Because moving the logic into the back end meant dependencies between all of these different parts of the system, product changes. We also had to do even more coordination between many different teams. Our engineering teams are distributed, and we had to move across multiple of them to make this work. There was migration risk. We'd only be producing the signal from now onwards. We couldn't replay history. And there was a lot of organizational friction. But it also meant we could finally make a metric a property of the system itself, and not an interpretation layer on top of it. So conviction is not just about having an idea. You've had that idea. But it's defining the principal way to fix the system. What's the right solution? Where should its source of truth be? It might not be the easiest path, and you will have to balance the necessity of speed versus the perfect solution, but you will find a solution that scales in there. And I think something that's resonated with me a lot from people I've spoken to is you don't need to just define the end path. You must define a stage plan that's going to deliver you incremental value along the way, because that will mean people believe you and they come with you on this journey. Which takes you on to validation and alignment. This is the stage of the story where you have to make tough decisions. In our case, this metric had years of operational history. There was fear. There was secrecy. Everyone was uncomfortable on how it was calculated. And at Monzo, a company that defaults to transparency, this felt so uneasy. None of us felt comfortable or safe in this place. It meant there was also a lot of strong opinions on what the right outcome was, what the right metric was. So we did triangulate. We listened. We heard people's opinions. But at the same time, we had to give the team space to lead the decision-making. I wanted to put a little side note here, to remember that better ideas in history have not always won. Betamax versus VHS. Just leave that one there. And this is where the playbook does get messy in reality, because you're not always going to have a comfortable timeline. Your system might be causing harm. You might have operational pressure, meaning you have to move before you're going to get full agreement here. In our case, with our measurement problem, we were actually in a great place where tech, data, and product came together pretty quickly. However, operational trust took us a lot longer. So we ended up in a situation, the challenge became, how do we move responsibly while bringing people with us as fast as possible? And this is where Monzo's default to transparency, again, was really helpful, because we shared how the metric was working, where it failed in the past, where it was failing now, when we made mistakes, and what we were uncertain about, and also how we were making decisions moving forward. Because transparency didn't eliminate the disagreement, but it made the disagreement discussable. And that's what allowed trust to grow. Because work in this phase scales because of relationships. It works because we connected it to the incentives of the teams around us. It moved because of sponsorship. We had very senior stakeholder buy-in into this complicated project, and it really helped. And it stuck. We delivered it. We got to the end because of trust. And trust is built, right? You might have seen this triangle before. Credibility, reliability, and safety. Credibility. Do you know what you're talking about? We proved that through prototypes, through data, through showing our working and getting people to come on that journey with us. Through reliability, we did that with Do You Follow Through? And the point I said about iterative and incremental value will help you build that reliability. And safety. Do people feel comfortable engaging with you? Can you collaborate with them? Do they feel heard? And we'll talk more about an example of this in the next section. I think in this phase, it's really important to remember to not be attached to your idea, because the goal isn't your idea winning, it's the right solution emerging for the team. Because validation isn't about being right. It's about making your thinking believable, and it becomes real when people commit. So if conviction, the last phase, was about choosing the right solution, validation is getting the organization to move with you. You need to take your hypothesis and expose it to the organization. That means exposing your thinking, asking for challenge, and iterating in the open. And I wanted to note that commitment has shape. People will say people are committed to their idea, but I found unless it's on the roadmap, unless it has time, unless you have backing, and other priorities have moved to make space for your one, you don't have commitment. You've got to turn your good idea into a shared direction for the team. Multiplication, the last phase. Because you've had the great idea, you've got the backing, it's moving, but that's not the end of the story for a staff engineer. Because once something works, the challenge becomes making it last. And that's where the work really changed for me personally, because it stopped being about what I could do and started being about what the organization could do without me in the room. So we focused heavily on visibility and shared understanding. I provided regular updates. Others had transparent rollouts. We'd openly discuss our failures and uncertainty. And one of the things we did to lean in this transparency space was we decided to expose more of the operational system to our frontline staff that were living in the tool every day. So we made a modal so that the team could see what we were reporting in the back end, so that our frontline staff could tell us whether we had accuracy there. They could come to us before the problem arose by us forecasting the wrong staff in the end. And over time, through modeling all these behaviors, something interesting started happening. The questions I was asking at the beginning started spreading. I'd hear people in meetings ask the questions I had asked. And that's when I realized that the impact had moved beyond this original metric we were trying to solve for. And we weren't just changing a single calculation. We started changing how people thought about operational systems, measurement, and trust. And that's what multiplication really looks like. Your thinking spreads, not through instruction, but by example. Because I'd have found that multiplication can't really be taught, it's observed. And I have a great quote that I think sums this up from an internal fireside chat we had at Monzo on mentorship and sponsorship. And I've got permission to use the name. Tom, our group CFO, said that the best mentor I have ever had didn't even know I was their mentee. And that's called silent mentoring, because what you mentor becomes how the organization thinks. So if validation was getting people to commit, multiplication is making that thinking scale without you. You're building capability, modeling thinking, asking better questions so that others can ask them too. Now, a bit of that feels uneasy because early on, being needed feels good, right? As an early engineer, having people rely on you and have you be a dependent in the system is a good feedback loop. You feel like you're doing your job well. But if you are so indispensable to the system, you can't step away to have greater impact. You can't step away to take on the bigger challenges and scale the work past you. So move from being indispensable to building something that doesn't depend on you. That's multiplication. not scaling yourself, but scaling how the organization thinks. And your impact won't just be what you deliver, it will be what continues without you. So when I started my career, I thought being good at this job was executing well on harder and harder problems. And I came to realize it's not just what you build, it's how you think. You need to move from solving problems to identifying what's worth solving, working in the system to understanding the system, and then shaping the system so they don't need you. And it follows a pattern. You start by seeing the system clearly, seeing what doesn't quite make sense. You define the right solution. It might not be the easiest one, but the one that fixes the problem at source. You make it believable so that other people choose to move with you, and then you make it scale without you. That's the playbook. And for a long time, I thought creativity and technical work were separate things. But eventually, I realized creativity is how you see systems. It's noticing patterns, seeing contradictions, imagining something better, and then helping other people see it too. So I love a photo at a conference. So if you want a copy of the playbook, the 4-part model that I've just walked through, I've put it all on one slide. Please grab a photo. I've captured the practical steps that you can take to implement this in your day-to-day work. These are the systems that I found help me, and I'd love to know if they help you too. Please let me know. Thank you all so much for your time.